Hello from Valour, Canada. We are a Calgary-based nonprofit with the goal of educating Canadians, especially young Canadians, about our country's military history and heritage. This presentation is about the Battle of Vimy Ridge and Canada's efforts there. There is a second part to this video that presents an activity for students in grades 4 to 12. Look for the link to that video in the description. So let's begin. The flag shown on the screen there is the red ensign. This is Canada's flag during the First World War. The Royal Union flag, so the Union Jack, is up here in the canton of the flag, so the top left quarter of the flag. This marks Canada as a Dominion of Britain, and the shield, each quarter, represents one of the province's coat of arms. In the top left here we see Ontario, okay. Top right we see Quebec, and here we have New Brunswick, and in the bottom left we have Nova Scotia. The presentation will begin by looking at the Schlieffen Plan and the beginning of the First World War. Next we'll see how the Battle of Vimy Ridge is important to Canadian history. Then we'll look at what the Canadian Corps did prior to the battle in order to improve their chance of success. Next, we'll go to the tunnels underneath Vimy Ridge, and then the war in the air over top of Vimy Ridge. We'll look at the beginning of the battle, 0 hour, and the Victoria Cross winners, and we'll finish by looking at the cost of the battle. The fighting of the First World War, at least on the Western Front, began with the Schlieffen Plan, a plan that prescribed an attack on France after moving quickly through Belgium, turning counterclockwise, encircling, and then taking the French capital city of Paris. The plan looks like this. And you can see that the German forces are massed on their western border, particularly in the north. In the south, down here, the Germans were simply aiming to hold the line because they thought that the French would throw more force against the shared French-German border. The French did not anticipate an attack from Germany through neutral Belgium here. Now, Schlieffen dictated that the German attack should take a maximum of 6 weeks. Don't forget that this movement would have been entirely by foot, horseback, and on very seldom occasion by vehicle or train. So many of the soldiers, having marched such a long distance and having faced some stiff resistance along the way, especially in Belgium, those soldiers were quite exhausted by the time they approached Paris. Now, the Schlieffen Plan also laid out that once Paris was captured and secured, the majority of the German soldiers would be sent to Germany's eastern border, so off of the map to your right, and once ready, a new attack would be initiated against the Russians. Well, unfortunately for the Germans, they were unable to capture Paris, and once they realized this, the German generals decided that their soldiers should dig in to protect their gains. And they did a bit of a cost-benefit analysis. And by that I mean that they pulled back and they selected the highest pieces of the landscape, those that were most easily defended, upon which they would build their fortifications. Now, high pieces of the land were easier to defend for 3 reasons. First, it's much easier to monitor the surroundings from atop a hill. Second, it's easier to defend downhill because gravity is assisting the defender. And in contrast, the attacker moving uphill expends more energy moving and maintaining their momentum. And then thirdly, when we think of the trench warfare that resulted almost immediately after the front or along the front line, should rain occur, those at the top of the hill could more easily drain their fortifications downhill into the enemy's positions. So as the Germans dug in and built their defensive positions, the battle line between the opposing forces was drawn. And we can see that here with the black line. Okay, this is basically the front line very early on the war. That line marks the location where the infamous First World War trench warfare began. And as you can see, that battle line goes right through Vimy Ridge. And that's correct. German forces held Vimy Ridge right from the very beginning of the war. And once Canada's attack on Vimy Ridge began on April 9th, 1917, the Germans had already been there for 2.5 years. Why is the battle so important to Canadian history? Well, first off, it was a Canadian success. Countries tend to remember their wins much more often than their losses. And to add to that, both the British and French armies fought against the German defenders upon the ridge for 2.5 years prior. And although they were able to push closer and closer to the ridge, they were not able to dislodge their enemy, but the Canadians did. Secondly, this was the first battle where the entire Canadian Corps was together on the same battlefield and targeting the same objective. It's important to note that the Canadian Corps was still under a British commander at Vimy, Julian Byng, the photo on the left. The Canadian Corps wouldn't have a Canadian commander until the next battle, the Battle of Hill 70 in August, which is when Canadian Arthur Currie took over. Currie's the man on the right. A bit of a sidebar, Byng's life would forever be tied to Canada after Vimy. He became Canada's Governor General for the first half of the 1920s, and he and his wife lived in Canada for years before moving back to England to retire. Currie, having been Byng's understudy when he was commander of the 1st Division at Vimy, he was promoted in June upon Byng's recommendation. Currie continued to have success through to the war's end on November 11, 1918, and he became widely perceived as one of the best generals in the First World War. Anyhow, back to Vimy. There were approximately 100,000 Canadians at Vimy. Between 15 and 20,000 Canadians attacked in the first wave. Thousands more followed over the next few days. And now for those of you who are sharp with math, you're probably wondering where the other tens of thousands are. Well, we can't forget the artillery units, okay? And the artillery units are the soldiers that operate the big cannons. And we shouldn't forget the thousands of infantry that are going to be held in reserve. You've also got work battalions. These are the men that process lumber, build and repair things, etc. You've got communications units that operate radios and run cables so that the different units on the battlefield can stay in communication with one another. You've got cooks. People need to eat and drink. And you've got thousands involved in bringing and distributing those foodstuffs and water, plus any other equipment, supplies, ammunition, and so on. You've also got doctors and nurses. You have veterinarians to take care of the horses. There would have easily been tens of thousands of horses at Vimy, and they need to eat too, and so on. So you can imagine this is a pretty huge production. And it's easy to better understand how easily 100,000 Canadians could be found at Vimy. Now, a third reason why Canada's success at Vimy is important to Canadian history is that some consider Vimy as the birth of Canada. And although there is certainly some nationalist myth building here, there is evidence in support of this argument, some much stronger than others. For example, Brigadier General Ross, who was a soldier on the ground at Vimy, said that he thought then, in those few minutes, he witnessed the birth of a nation. However, that's not the best evidence because he said that in 1967, 50 years after the battle ended. For some better evidence, we can go underneath Vimy to the tunnels of chalk in which soldiers found themselves for hours and days prior to the battle, sheltering and waiting for the day of the attack to arrive. For those of you who don't know, chalk is a type of soft rock that is easy to mark. So the men in the tunnels would carve into the wall to pass time. And some of the men carved maple leaves, like this one, with the word Canada clearly visible. And if you look closely, you can see on the bottom there's a banner and it says Machine Gun Battalion. Many of those soldiers in those tunnels and in the trenches really did see themselves as Canadian at that point, and multiple diary entries, another pastime while in the trenches and tunnels, They also explicitly describe feeling Canadian and having brethren in their unit from different parts of the nation. There clearly were many soldiers at Vimy who had thought about the idea of Canada as a country and that they could be a part of it. This drawing, looking east-northeast at Vimy Ridge, was sketched by Walter Draycott, a PPCLI soldier who served at Vimy. PPCLI is Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. This is the name of one of the Canadian units at Vimy. So looking at the sketch, we see that it isn't a very high ridge, but in the region, it was the highest elevation. And when attacking, Canadian soldiers had to gain about 10 to 20 meters to reach the high points on the ridge. But on the backside, which we'll look at on the next slide, the drop in elevation is quite significant. Like on the backside, we're looking at about 50 to 70 meters. It really wasn't much, but in that area, it was, the ridge that is, was the dominant landform on the landscape. And as mentioned previously, the high ground is extremely advantageous because of those reasons that I mentioned earlier: sight lines, gravity, and higher drainage potential. And in this case here, the German defenders could drain their position into the Canadian trenches. Here we are looking west-northwest at the northern half of the ridge. Okay, so we're on the back side now. And you can see how there is a much more significant drop-off on this side of the ridge. And for those of you with a sharp eye, you've probably already noticed something on the horizon that doesn't really belong there. This thing right here. Does anyone know what that is? Well, if you guessed the Vimy Monument, you got it. That is the Canadian National Vimy Memorial, and it is built on the highest point of the ridge, Hill 145. And that 145 represents how many meters above sea level that position is. And you'll notice that in a lot of battles in war, they're named after the elevation on the landscape. I mentioned Hill 70 earlier. This is the next big battle the Canadian Corps was involved in after Vimy. The Battle of Hill 70, it was for a piece of land that was 70 meters above sea level. Anyhow, back to the image here. What does it look? Looking towards where we're standing now? Well, this photo here was taken in May 1917, the month after the Canadians took the ridge. And we can see some Canadian soldiers right here in the bottom, and then there's a couple more over here. And they're looking east-northeast from Vimy Ridge. And again, we can see how or why the ridge was such an important strategic position in the area, because these soldiers could overlook the Douai Plain in northern France. Canadian units began to arrive at Vimy in late 1916, and they immediately began to prepare. By March, the British soldiers had been fully relieved by the Canadian Corps. Preparation and practice by the Canadians increased in frequency and intensity. The goal was to improve the likelihood of a successful attack. Specialized training continued. Bomb throwing of Mills bombs, shown here. The First World War's version of a grenade was simple enough to practice, with fakes. Bayonets, which for those of you who are unfamiliar, a bayonet is basically a knife that you affix to the barrel of your gun, and this gives you a stabbing hand-to-hand combat weapon, like this picture here, that shows soldiers practicing stabbing bran bags stuffed with straw. And they would also have contests against each other, again with safer replicas, like this one here. Here's a photo showing a drill instructor operating a dummy against a soldier that's learning proper technique. Marksmanship Well, this is simply accurate shooting, and it's practiced by spending time on the shooting range. Platoon tactics were also a new thing during the First World War, and the Canadians became so adept at this that by the end of the war, especially during the final 100 days, German soldiers dreaded meeting Canadian shock troops on the battlefield. But what were platoon tactics and why were they new? Well, if you've seen any war movies set in the mid or late 1800s or earlier, you know that most often at the beginning of the battle, soldiers line up side by side in a row and attack across the battlefield. The first row shoots, then kneels and reloads. The second row follows behind and shoots at the enemy once the front row has kneeled and is reloading. And they alternate doing this, primarily because they are using single-shot weapons, whether muskets or breechloads. So my question, why did this strategy fail to work during the First World War? Well, if you said machine guns, you got it. One or two soldiers operating a machine gun on the opposing side of that battlefield could wreak extreme havoc on those side-by-side rows of 100 or so infantry. Machine guns were first invented in the mid-1800s, but they were heavy and unreliable. They didn't become very widespread until the end of that century, after they had been improved significantly. By the time the First World War started, not only were machine guns better, but there were light machine guns that an individual soldier could carry and shoot on his own. So back to platoon tactics. Platoons were a development to increase on-the-battlefield flexibility. Essentially, a platoon was a small group of soldiers, let's say 40 or so, who were divided into two smaller groups, squads of, let's say, 20 soldiers each. Once meeting with the enemy opposition, so if we look at the image here, let's say the enemy's here, okay? So once meeting with the enemy opposition, one squad, so we'll say our Canadians are over here, one squad would start exchanging fire with the enemy. So you get fire going between the two groups, okay? So the other squad, we'll say is here, they go around the outside and then they attack the enemy from the side. Take them out, okay? So this is what's called a flanking maneuver. Take them out from the side, and then this squad here catches up. So essentially, platoons had a bit of a random weave across the battlefield, taking out enemy opposition and strong points as they went. And this was a pretty neat adaptation in response to technological change. And like I said earlier, the Canadians became darn good at it. Another innovation was the movement of infantry timed to coordinate with a creeping barrage. I'll explain that in detail on the next slide, but first I want to point out the image on the screen. This is a scale model of the German trenches and defenses at Vimy. You can see Canadian soldiers walking past the model, the back of the photograph. Units of soldiers came here repeatedly before the battle, trying to memorize the portion of the enemy trenches they would be responsible for once the attack began. And plans of the attack were rehearsed. The idea behind the memorizing was that once the battle started, so did the chaos on the battlefield. And if a soldier, surrounded by explosions, whizzing bullets, screams, smoke, craters, barbed wire, maybe the chaos was so much that he lost his sense of direction. And if he memorized the battlefield and the enemy's positions, if he found himself, let's say, in the trench here, maybe he would remember this shape of the trench that kind of looks like an upside down W. And then he would remember which direction the enemy was. So he would be able to continue his attack in that direction. And this problem actually happened pretty frequently in the First World War, where soldiers became disoriented. And the attack would lose its momentum because soldiers would lose their sense of direction, and they would continue their attack in the wrong direction. So memorizing models like this was one of the things that the soldiers and the generals did in order to improve the chance of success once the battle started. Okay, the creeping barrage. So first off, the image on the left shows two artillery guns. Okay, so basically artillery is a fancy name for a cannon. Okay, these two look like howitzers, and a howitzer is a low angle trajectory gun, as opposed to mortars that kind of shoot high up in the air and it lobs and then it lands pretty much descending in a straight line. The Canadian Corps had approximately 1,000 of these artillery guns at Vimy, and they continuously hammered away at the German positions for the entire week prior to the April 9th attack, aiming to soften up the defenders for the Canadian infantry. They fired so many shells that the German defenders who survived Vimy Ridge called that period of time the Week of Suffering. Anyhow, these guns, for the sake of this explanation, shoot shells that go through the air and explode when they hit the ground. Now, the idea with the creeping barrage is that you can use these exploding shells to create a shield of explosions in front of your advancing infantry. And you can see that in the image on the right. Okay, if we look closely, we see this line of explosions ahead of the advancing artillery. Well, how would this work? Well, basically you tell your artillery units to aim their first shot for this location on the battlefield. And you tell them to aim their second shot for this location on the battlefield, their third shot here, fourth shot here, fifth shot, sixth shot, seventh shot, eighth shot, and so on. And you send your infantry behind these exploding shells, hence the time coordination. So, two questions for you. First, what if your infantry is too fast? Yes, good thinking. If they're too fast, they would get hit by their own shells. And this is called friendly fire. And even though military technology is much more advanced nowadays, friendly fire still happens. In fact, Canada had soldiers die in Afghanistan from friendly fire. Second question, and this is the tough one. What happens if the infantry is too slow? Well, here's a hint. Imagine yourself as a German soldier atop the ridge. You see and you hear this wall of explosions getting closer and closer. What do? Well, if you didn't know, trenches have these other things called dugouts, and this is like a room dug deeper than the trench into the ground, and soldiers would go in here to shelter during heavy attacks like this. And when they're in these dugouts, you can hear and you can actually feel the vibrations of these explosions getting closer and closer. So you go down in there because you can't run away. That's considered desertion and abandoning your post, and the punishment is normally hanging or firing squad. But you decide to take shelter by going into these dugouts, and once you feel and hear that the explosions have moved past you, you go back up into the trench and you start setting up your machine gun. And if the Canadians are too slow, they're still out in no man's land by the time you get your machine gun set up and loaded. And you know what happens next. Now, another important note about artillery. Artillery was responsible for 75% of the deaths of soldiers in the First World War. The underground city. I mentioned the chalk tunnels beneath Vimy earlier. These tunnels existed since at least medieval times. The British, the French, and then the Canadians all improved and expanded the tunnels while they were fighting at Vimy. At the time of the Canadian attack, there were 12 tunnels in use. A few of them were very long, a few very deep. In fact, the Goodman Tunnel was an incredible 1.2 kilometers long, and the Zivy Tunnel had a massive side room that could hold 300 soldiers. Today, tourists can only visit the Grange Tunnel when they go visit Vimy Ridge. Anyhow, the tunnels gave the attackers some big advantages. including an area to store material like food, water, supplies, ammunition, as well as soldiers. Most important among these advantages was that the tunnels provided a covered and protected route to the front line, and this meant that no lives were lost on the approach. Plus, the enemy could not see the approach, so it ensured a better chance of a surprise attack. Now, this image here shows the entrance to the Coburg tunnel, and if you look closely, you can see that there are some what looks to be some small train tracks here, and they would use trains, small mini trains, to bring in supplies and equipment and soldiers. And I'm not sure if these tracks turn and go directly into the subway. It may just go past, and perhaps they unload materials here and carry them in by hand. Another technological innovation during the First World War was the use of aircraft, primarily to scout the enemy's positions. However, at the start of the war, hot air balloons tethered to the ground were most often used for this purpose. Soldiers would be sent up in a balloon close enough to the enemy to be able to scout their positions, but far enough away to be outside of their firing range. Soldiers inside the basket would take notes about the enemy, maybe they draw a map, and then they would be pulled back down to the ground and their information assessed and shared out. After a while, balloons became targets for aircraft, and then the shift began. But flying was very dangerous, partly because airplanes were such a new technology and they had a tendency to be unreliable. In fact, your family car can reach faster speeds than many of these early airplanes. Another thing that increased the danger for pilots were the open cockpits. These open cockpits required pilots to dress in thick clothing to stay warm, which in turn restricted their reaction time and so on. You'll note that the image shows a machine gun mounted on the fuselage. So the fuselage is the body of the airplane. And we can see one here. Now, this posed some problems, some technological problems, and it wasn't until 1916 that they came up with a solution to the problem. Can you see what the problem is? Yes, if the pilot pulls the trigger here and the bullet isn't timed properly, the pilot's going to shoot his own propeller off and crash and probably die. And like I said, it wasn't until 1916 that there was a German engineer that invented a mechanism to make it so that those bullets would go between the spinning propeller blades. Craziness. Perhaps the craziest part was that soldiers volunteered to join the Royal Flying Corps. Some joined because they wanted to fly, some because they were bored of life in the trenches. Others wanted glory. And one of the things that I want you to remember from this presentation is that pilots in the First World War only lived on average for 3 to 4 weeks. 3 to 4 weeks. Craziness. And remember when I mentioned the week of suffering? Well, the Royal Flying Corps lost 131 aircraft during that week, but we were able to gain control of the skies over Vimy, and that allowed us to better target enemy positions before the infantry's attack on April the 9th. Does anyone know who's in this image? Yes, it's the Red Baron, Germany's top flying ace during the First World War, von Richthofen. Zero hour, which means the time of the attack, was at 5:30 a.m. on April 9th, 1917. And within 48 hours, almost all of the ridge was held by Canadians. A side note for those who go on to study military history in more depth, many of the big battles that occur throughout history begin first thing in the morning because a fighting force is most easily moved into position under the cover of darkness, and the best chance of a surprise attack is achieved. The painting here is by artist Richard Jack, and it's called The Taking of Vimy Ridge, Easter Monday, 1917. And there's a lot of information shown here. For example, you can see a big artillery gun here, some soldiers in the artillery unit, about to load a shell into the breech. This gentleman here, if you look closely, he's got binoculars, so he's probably spotting for these gentlemen. We can see what they're firing at. This is Vimy Ridge back here with all the smoke from these exploding shells that I mentioned. There are some injured Canadians coming back from the front. And then behind them, if you look closely, it looks like wagons or maybe even a light train. And there's an entrance to a tunnel here. And then back to the foreground, there's a rum ration here. Soldiers will be given a little bit of rum each day to help them stay warm, especially their feet in the trenches. So yeah, you can see why this is such a famous Canadian war painting. The Victoria Cross is the most prestigious award in Commonwealth country militaries. So it was very important that 4 Canadians received one for their courageous actions at Vimy. Victoria Crosses are awarded for acts of valor, quote, in the face of the enemy, end quote. The first one I'm going to take a quick look at is Sergeant Ellis Sifton from Wallacestown, Ontario. And on the first day of the battle, his unit was being peppered by heavy machine gun fire. He jumped into the enemy trench, overturned their machine gun, and bayoneted them. Then he held off a few counterattacks by using his rifle like a club. His unit held the position, but Sifton had been hit, and he died later that day. The second Canadian soldier who received a Victoria Cross for their courageous actions at Vimy is William Milne from Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan. And on the first day of the battle, he took 2 machine gun nests, the first while crawling on his hands and knees, and the second by throwing Mills bombs in and disabling the machine gunners. Shortly after taking the second one, he was hit by fire and his body was never recovered. The third Canadian soldier to receive a Victoria Cross for their actions at Vimy is John Pattison of Calgary, Alberta. And on the second day of the battle at Hill 145, which if you'll recall, that's where the modern day, the current day Vimy Monument is located. His unit was held up by withering machine gun fire, and he felt like he had to do something, so he jumped from shell hole to shell hole, keeping under cover, and then he bombed and bayoneted the machine gunners and eventually took their position. So pretty heroic. I have a few interesting stories about John Pattison. First off, he enlisted when he was in his early 40s, and when I tell students that, they say, well, why did he enlist when he was so old? And the reason is he had a son who enlisted, and John enlisted to make sure that his son Henry returned home safely. Well, Henry did return home safely, but John Pattison was hit by an artillery shell about 2 months after the Battle of Vimy, and he never came home. Another, and this one's kind of a fun story. When John Pattison first went to enlist, the recruiter said, "No, you're too short." So John Pattison did not meet the minimum height requirement, and they wouldn't let him join. But after a few weeks, he tried again, and by that time, the Canadian Corps was needing more men, and they accepted him. Now, the last of the 4 Canadians to receive a Victoria Cross for their actions at Vimy is Thane McDowell, and he's from Brockville, Ontario, and his story is pretty incredible. Again, near Hill 145, he took a machine gun nest, and when he jumped into the position, he noticed an entrance to a dugout. And you know, we've seen the movies, right? We know what soldiers do when they see a hole in the ground. They pull the pin out of the grenade and they throw the grenade down there, and that's it. They're good to go. Well, for whatever reason, McDowell did not do that. He decided he was going to go into the dugout. So he goes down this 55-step ladder, and he comes out into this room, and there's 77, 78 German soldiers looking at him, and like, what do you do, right? It's 1 against 77. So he decides to bluff them, and he yells up the ladder. He's like, okay, guys, I'm going to start sending them up a few at a time. And some of those Germans in that room, they understand English, so they realize what he's saying. And while one of the German officers doesn't believe him, and the German officer pulls his pistol and takes a shot at McDowell, actually shoots one of McDowell's fingers off. McDowell pulls his pistol and shoots the German officer dead, and the rest surrender. So he took over 70 German soldiers prisoner by himself. Incredible. Now, McDowell did survive the war. He was the only one of the 4 Victoria Cross winners from the Battle of Vimy Ridge to survive, and he's buried in a cemetery near Brockville, Ontario. So this is Vimy Ridge and the Vimy Monument as it looks nowadays. And look at these shell holes. Like, these are from those exploding artillery shells. And this is 100 years later, right? So imagine what this looked like when it was fresh. And compare it to this farmer's field here. This would have been exactly the same as this, but this here has been driven over and plowed up by tractor and plow for 100 years. Now you can also see over here by the monument, the ground looks like a normal lawn, like it's nice and flat and landscaped and everything. And that's because they had reclamation crews come in here and remove any unexploded dud munitions. And now people can walk safely in here. But if you look closely here, you can see these white flags. And this is actually an electric fence. And the electric fence is not to keep people out, although that's part of it, but it's to keep sheep and goats in. That's how they keep the grass short in here, by sheep and goats grazing. Because it's too risky to send somebody in with a weed eater, because if just the right amount of weight steps in just the wrong spot, kaboom, and that person could die. So this is the legacy, well, one of the legacies of the First World War. A lot of the countryside in France still has hundreds, thousands, probably hundreds of thousands of unexploded munitions in the ground. And each spring, metals come up to the surface. Farmers call this the iron harvest, and many times these are unexploded munitions that the bomb squad need to come and remove safely. The cost of the battle: almost 3,600 Canadian soldiers died. That's 1 Canadian soldier for every second, if you count every second in an hour. And there were over 10,000 Canadian casualties. Now, to compare this to Canada's efforts on D-Day, Canada lost 360 soldiers to death, and they had around 1,000 casualties. So you can see that the Battle of Vimy Ridge had a much higher cost for Canada. Now this is the eastward-looking side of eastward-facing side, I should say, of the Vimy Monument, and you can see some statues. Each one of these statues represents something. There's some up here. If you'd like to learn more, go on to Google and do a search. I'm going to talk a little bit about this one right here. If you look closely, you can see 2 adult-sized figures looking skyward, and then you see this smaller person here, and they're kind of bent over with their arms straight down on the ground, and they actually have a sword, and they're trying to break the sword over a stone in protest of the violence of war. Now, another interesting story about the Vimy Monument. There were a lot of monuments built in France following the First World War, and the large majority of those monuments were they portrayed more victory and triumph, as opposed to the Canadian monument shown here, that you can see that there's a lot of grief shown, especially this figure here, grief and loss. And during the Second World War, when the Germans were in control of France, many of the monuments from the First World War were desecrated and destroyed by Nazi soldiers. And interestingly, Hitler ordered his soldiers not to do anything bad to this Canadian monument, because Hitler felt that this monument showed mourning and loss, and it should be protected. Another interesting fact about Hitler was a soldier in the First World War. He served, and the unit he served in was supposed to be dispatched to Vimy Ridge a few weeks before the Canadians attacked, but there was a change of plans at the last minute, and Hitler's unit was moved elsewhere. So, what if that change in plan had never happened, and Hitler would have been one of the German defenders at Vimy when the Canadians attacked? Perhaps he would have been killed in the battle, and the Second World War never would have happened.